If you look at a major economic powerhouse today, what do you see? Towering modern skylines piercing the clouds, bustling stock exchanges moving billions of dollars in seconds, advanced tech, and world-class universities. It's so easy to just look at these massive success stories and assume, well, that it was inevitable, that they were just always wealthy, always powerful. But history tells a very different story, right? Because every single successful nation had to start somewhere. Before becoming these gleaming economic titans, a lot of them faced deep poverty, huge political uncertainty, and massive structural challenges. Today, we're going to completely decode the architecture of wealth. Which brings us to a really fascinating mystery. How exactly does a country go from struggling to thriving? How does a nation actually escape poverty to transform itself into a modern global success story? Well, spoiler alert, it isn't luck, and it's definitely not an accident. It is a precise, meticulously built combination of geography, strong institutions, innovation, and the bold people who relentlessly drive growth. Let's dive right in with the first ingredient, geography and opportunity.
We have to start with the physical foundations of national wealth. Historically speaking, opportunity begins with the hand of cards a country is dealt geographically. We're talking about access to navigable rivers, deep water oceans, abundant natural resources buried right there in the soil, and strategic locations along major trade routes. For centuries, these natural assets were the absolute fastest way for isolated nations to get rich. Countries that could easily exchange goods, share ideas, and import new tech because of where they were physically located developed vastly faster than those locked away from the rest of the world. Think about it. A deep-water port wasn't just a place to park a ship. It was a literal gateway that accelerated the flow of global capital.
But here is the brutal truth of history. Geography alone absolutely does not guarantee success. The world is honestly filled with resource-rich countries that, unfortunately, just remained poor. So what actually matters isn't just having the resources sitting in the ground or along the coast. It's how those natural resources are utilized, managed, and fiercely protected through strong societal systems.
Which leads us perfectly to the second ingredient, strong institutions. Institutions are basically the invisible framework that takes those dormant natural resources and actually turns them into sustained economic activity and compounding growth. Successful countries intentionally build systems that encourage this activity. These are the pillars of trust. We're talking about strictly enforced property rights, binding contracts, stable governments, reliable courts, and highly secure banking systems. Just think about it for a second. When people truly believe that their hard work, their life savings, and their investments are permanently protected by the law, human behavior fundamentally changes. People suddenly feel confident enough to take significant risks. They start new businesses, they invest their capital for the long haul, they hire workers. And that is exactly the moment a nation's economic growth kicks into overdrive.
The crucial point is captured perfectly by this idea. Without trust in institutions, long-term growth becomes difficult. Trust is literally the ultimate foundation. It's the bedrock that safeguards the very investments that build a wealthy society. Without it, capital just quickly flees across borders and progress completely stalls. But with it, a nation becomes an absolute magnet for global investment.
Moving right along to the third ingredient, innovation and human capital.
So this incredible foundation of trust creates the perfect environment for human ingenuity to thrive. And across the decades, we've seen a dizzying, relentless acceleration of technology. From the massive steel of the steam engine powering the 18th century, to electricity in automobiles completely reshaping the 19th, to computers and the internet dominating the 20th, right up to artificial intelligence today in the 21st century. Each of these eras didn't just slightly improve the old ways of doing things. No, they birthed entirely new, multi-billion-dollar industries that literally did not exist before. Countries that aggressively embraced this wave of innovation gained enormous geopolitical advantages, generating massive wealth practically out of thin air.
But there is a catch here. Technology is completely useless without the human mind to actually harness it. And that is exactly why human capital is the absolute secret weapon of wealthy nations. We are talking about an educated workforce capable of developing and utilizing these highly complex technologies. As global economies grew more advanced, the most successful countries realized, hey, we have to invest heavily in schools, world-class universities, and research centers. They knew they needed brilliant scientists to make discoveries, precise engineers to build new systems, and specialized workers to run them. Ultimately, an educated workforce became the absolute most valuable asset a nation could possibly possess.
Next up is the fourth ingredient, infrastructure and entrepreneurship. Once a nation has those brilliant minds and cutting-edge tech, it needs the physical capacity to scale it all up. Roads, expansive railways, massive automated ports, interconnected power grids, and lightning-fast telecommunications networks. Now I know, they might not sound quite as glamorous as artificial intelligence, but imagine trying to run a modern, high-speed economy without them. If the power grid fails, or if goods can't move efficiently from a rural factory to a coastal cargo ship, well, economic growth just grinds to a halt. Successful nations poured billions into this physical infrastructure because they understood a simple truth. A towering economic skyscraper requires a deep, incredibly strong physical foundation to actually survive. And that massive physical infrastructure paves the way for the microstory of wealth creation on the ground, the path of entrepreneurship. Every successful economy heavily depends on everyday people willing to take incredible risks. It almost always starts with just a small idea, maybe a tiny garage startup. Then, with sheer grit and a lot of determination, it becomes a small workshop or a modest office. As that business expands, it starts generating much-needed jobs for the local community. And eventually, a few of these turn into massive global giants that generate unbelievable wealth. These bold entrepreneurs are the ones transforming abstract ideas into tangible economic value, providing the immense tax revenue that seamlessly funds a nation's continued growth. This brings us to the fifth ingredient, productivity and trade. Everything we've talked about really hinges on one vital, transformative concept, productivity. Simply put, productivity is the measure of how much economic value workers can produce in a given amount of time. Now, I know that might sound like a dry economic textbook term, but is actually the simplest, most powerful engine of prosperity ever discovered. When productivity rises, thanks to those better tools, better education, and better infrastructure we just talked about, the entire economic pie gets bigger. Workers can finally earn significantly higher wages, companies rake in larger profits, and the overall standard of living improves dramatically for everyone. It's a real game changer. And this surging productivity unlocked a massive multiplier effect. Global trade allowed successful countries to just stop trying to manufacture absolutely everything themselves. Instead, they hyper-specialized in what they did best, exported those high-value products, and tapped into massive new global markets. This staggering level of global economic integration helped accelerate modern growth to light speed. Suddenly, a single complex product could be designed in one country, manufactured in another, and sold to billions worldwide. And finally, we look at the result, the rise of prosperity. When you combine those geographic advantages, strong institutions, relentless innovation, massive infrastructure, and global trade over several decades, you achieve something historically remarkable. You get a deeply entrenched middle class. Really, for the first time in human history, average families could afford an incredibly high quality of life. We're talking about widespread homeownership, cars parked in the driveway, accessible high-quality health care, higher education for the kids, and robust retirement savings. The wealth wasn't just hoarded at the very top anymore. It pushed outward, exponentially raising incomes and fundamentally transforming the entire society. What is truly beautiful about this phase of success is how it creates a powerful, self-reinforcing cycle. Think about it. Prosperity naturally increases consumer spending. When citizens actually have money in their pockets, they enthusiastically buy goods and services. That robust consumer spending then grows local and national businesses even further. Those growing businesses turn around and hire more people, pay higher wages, which creates even more prosperous citizens. For decades, this incredible flywheel effect created an absolute powerhouse of wealth creation and profound national stability. But, as we all know, history never stops moving, and success always breeds its own unique set of pressures. As countries become richer, the costs of living and doing business inevitably increase. the expectations of their citizens rapidly elevate, and ruthless global competition becomes fiercer than ever before. The very same systems that helped create this monumental success must now face entirely new, modern pressures from hyperglobalization, shifting demographic tides, and relentless technological disruption.
Which leads us with a final, deeply provocative thought. Becoming successful is one challenge. Staying successful is another challenge entirely. This national success was painstakingly built through decades of innovation, strong institutions, and bold entrepreneurship. But while these economic powerhouses appeared stronger than ever, hidden problems were quietly beginning to grow right beneath the gleaming surface of their modern skylines.
You see, success can be incredibly deceptive. From the outside, everything looked absolutely flawless. Booming cities, the stock market just shattering records, and this luxury lifestyle being broadcast literally everywhere. But history shows us that the greatest structural failures, they don't just happen overnight. They grow slowly, quietly, until one day they're just impossible to ignore. Because on paper, this country was an absolute machine, hitting record highs, generating massive, unprecedented corporate wealth. But if you zoomed in, if you looked at the ordinary worker, you found a completely different, much darker reality. While the financial headlines were screaming about how invincible the economy was, everyday households were quietly drowning. Stagnant wages, mounting expenses, deep, pervasive job uncertainty. The macro data looked brilliant for sure, but for millions of people on the ground, the micro-reality felt significantly worse.
So this brings us to the central burning mystery of our explainer today. If the country was supposedly so incredibly successful, why were so many people struggling so hard? How could an economy look undeniably prosperous on the outside while everyday life felt increasingly impossible for ordinary citizens? Let's uncover the rot beneath the prosperity.
Section 1. The illusion of success and the wealth divide.
For decades, economic expansion had generally lifted society up together, but the rules of the game were changing, and they were changing fast. If you happened to own assets, businesses, stocks, real estate, your net worth was absolutely skyrocketing. Wealth was being created at a blistering pace for investors. But what about everyday wage earners? Well, income growth practically flatlined right as the cost of basic survival started to climb.
The crucial takeaway here is this: growth increasingly favored those who already owned valuable assets. The rising tide was no longer lifting all boats. Honestly, it was lifting the yachts and leaving everyone else just scrambling to tread water. And you can imagine, this bred a crushing, inescapable frustration from millions of people who felt like they were working harder than ever, yet continuously falling further and further behind.
Section 2. The cost of living squeeze. We entered an era defined by this massive, almost cruel paradox. People were earning more, but somehow they were affording less. Technically, people were taking home more actual dollars in their paychecks than previous generations ever did. But their actual purchasing power, it was quietly collapsing. The money simply did not go as far anymore. It created this mirage of progress that completely masked a rapid decline in actual day-to-day living standards.
Think about it. For previous generations, a stable job provided a pretty clear path to financial security. But look at what happened to just the bare essentials. Housing, healthcare, education, childcare. The foundational pillars of a secure life became intensely difficult to achieve. The costs of these necessities violently outpaced household incomes, basically eating up a larger, more suffocating share of a family's budget every single year.
Section 3. The debt trap. So what happens when paychecks simply can't stretch far enough to cover those exploding daily costs? Society turns to the only available lifeline. Millions and millions of people found themselves turning to borrowing. And not to buy luxury items or go on vacation, but as a permanent, desperate bridge between their flatlining incomes and their surging living expenses.
At first, low interest rates made this debt feel perfectly affordable, almost like free money. But what started as manageable borrowing quickly ballooned into an inescapable cycle. We're talking student loans, maxed out credit cards, massive mortgages, auto loans. Debt essentially morphed from an emergency tool into a completely normalized, fundamental requirement just to exist in the modern world.
But this massive debt explosion carried a terrifying hidden cost, and that was the total loss of financial freedom. As debt piled up, flexibility just completely disappeared. Even earning a higher salary no longer meant freedom, because huge portions of that future income were already promised to past borrowing. Millions were effectively trapped on a treadmill, where they couldn't save, couldn't invest, and honestly just couldn't breathe. Section 4. The changing workforce.
While households were drowning in personal debt, the very nature of how they earned a living was violently shifting right beneath their feet. Globalization completely rewired the economy. It allowed massive corporations to slash their production costs, tap into international markets, and drive up record profits. And sure, we got cheaper products out of it, but it completely hollowed out entire communities. Workers who had spent decades mastering industrial professions were suddenly just left stranded. And just as the factories left, the technological revolution arrived in full force. Automation, software, robotics, and artificial intelligence suddenly began eliminating administrative and white-collar roles at unprecedented speeds. And the terror wasn't just about losing a single job to a machine. It was this chilling realization that the fundamental rules of making a living just kept changing.
Suddenly, skills that were incredibly valuable yesterday could become almost worthless tomorrow. And this bred a deep psychological insecurity across the entire workforce. Entire industries were evolving way faster than human beings could possibly adapt to them. The anxiety of obsolescence didn't just affect the unemployed. It became a permanent, looming fixture in the minds of those who were still working.
Section 5. The structural cracks. Now let's zoom out to the macro level for a second because the very structure of society was starting to crack. Historically, real estate was the ultimate tool for building generational wealth, right? You bought a home, its value increased, and you built a life. But skyrocketing prices began locking young families out of the market entirely. Enormous down payments and crushing monthly costs cemented a permanent widening divide between those who owned assets and those trapped paying rent forever.
Simultaneously, there was a slow-moving demographic crisis building in the shadows. Birth rates were declining while populations were aging rapidly, and this created a truly terrifying mathematical equation. A slower-growing, shrinking workforce was being asked to support massive, exploding pension and healthcare obligations. It placed an absolutely unbearable, long-term pressure on the public finances of the state.
Section 6. A house of cards.
To maintain the illusion of endless prosperity despite all of these colliding headwinds, the entire economic system became dangerously addicted to one single thing: debt-driven growth. Governments borrowed, corporations borrowed, consumers borrowed. This massive accumulation of cheap debt created the perfect illusion of economic expansion, but in reality, it built a highly leveraged ecosystem with absolutely zero margin for error.
Individually, maybe each of these hidden issues could have been solvable, but together, rising inequality, explosive living costs, crushing consumer debt, job disruption, a housing crisis, and aging demographics. They were all compounding right beneath the surface, feeding off each other, and creating an unimaginable amount of structural pressure that was just waiting for a spark.
And yet, despite all of this, the financial headlines kept screaming about record profits. They focused purely on the shiny exterior, completely ignoring the massive foundational rot. The country still looked incredibly successful on the surface, but beneath that success, powerful forces were quietly reshaping the future. The reality is, economic success didn't eliminate the challenges, it simply mutated them into new, much larger, and far more complex threats.
We've laid out how these invisible forces perfectly set the stage for a massive reckoning. The country remained wealthy and influential, sure, but the foundations were buckling under the weight, which leaves us with one chilling final thought to ponder. The question now isn't how the country became successful. The question is whether this fragile house of cards can actually survive the challenges ahead, when the illusion finally fades.